Before I get into the meat of today's sermon, I want to offer what I believe to be a critical preface as we have this reading and this commemoration on a day throughout history in which Christians have used these texts as justification to persecute and murder Jewish people. So here's a couple of things to remember about this particular telling of the story, the Johannine community's telling of this story. You can hear the contestation, the bitterness, and the blame back and forth in it. The community that chose to tell this story this way, which is not the same way that the synoptic gospels tell it. We'll hear a different version of this from Mark this season. This community, this Johannine community, is living in double rejection. So they belong to the people of Israel, an oppressed and occupied people whose land has been conquered and overrun and is militarily controlled, economically controlled by the Roman Empire. So that's the big group that's experiencing persecution. Secondarily, as Jews who believed that Jesus was the anointed, they had been cast out of the synagogue and moved away into what we think is Asia Minor, Turkey, we think. We don't know for sure. So when we hear this community writing these texts, two things are happening. The first is that they are trying desperately to hold on to something that they understand to be truth, to claim that their way is the right way, and that the people who rejected them are wrong and depraved. And we definitely continue to do this exact same thing now. We attack most viciously the people who are near us instead of our shared common enemies. So when you hear this story of Jesus' death and trial, with all this bile directed at those Judeans, it is with that mouthful of grief and anger, brother against brother. Second, it's critical to remember that this text was written down 100 years later while Rome still occupied the area. And if you want to get a written document, which is precious at that time, passed hand to hand through this dangerous territory, it is smarter to de-emphasize the role of the Roman soldiers and to really play up the role of the collaborators who you're mad at anyway. So when someone gets caught belonging to this illegal and persecuted Messianic community, they can show the document and say, look, we definitely do not blame you guys. Please don't kill us. And the people writing these texts don't know yet that they're writing scripture. They're just telling the story the best they can to keep it alive. They really could not imagine that we would be in this beautiful church 2,000 years later reading this. And again, too, they're trying to convey meaning in this story. They have not gotten to the scientific revolution and our contemporary obsession with facts. They know better. They know the power of story beats dead facts any day. And remember, it is completely 100% true that Jewish people living under occupation had no power to crucify. They were not in charge of the government. They simply could not. Only Rome could make that decision and make it come true. That's all. That is where the blame lies. Let's talk about how Jesus got dead. From a distance of time and often of material comfort, we can engage in a somewhat performative theatrical horror at the fact that someone somewhere killed God. We make musicals about it. We create theologies that somehow assume that our feelings killed God. Like we were cranky with a waitress once and Jesus threw himself on a cross about it. We talk about debts and payments. But the fact remains that there was a real person who was alive and who was executed by this state. And this, in and of itself, isn't remarkable. In fact, it's so common that we still allow it to happen today with minimal resistance. And that's actually where I get curious. That our horror about this act actually has not made us, convicted us so strongly that we say this cannot happen again. So instead of obscuring, inflating, or explaining away the reality of the decision made about Jesus' life, let's talk about what makes it happen, why we keep doing it. Many of us are familiar with Stanley Milgram's experiments. He started in July of 1961, and his goal was to engage very real questions about how the Holocaust could have happened. Or, to get out of the passive voice, how ordinary people could have committed the Holocaust. When Adolf Eichmann went to trial around that time, you can listen to the tapes and hear the prosecutors ask him over and over, how is it possible that you came to commit genocide? You can hear him answer, it was not my personal affair. I had to do what I was ordered. The Milgram experiments strove to test this theory, that people will do anything if they're ordered by an authority to do it. So if you're not familiar with the experiments, here's the setup. They recruited someone to take one of two roles. There's 2 rooms with a window between, and the person who was being studied thought they were assisting the scientist in studying the other person, who was a plant. So the test subjects, who didn't know they were the subjects, were instructed to give the person in the next room a series of increasingly strong electric shocks whenever they answered a question wrong. The people receiving the shocks were acting, but the people delivering them, or fake delivering them, didn't know that. And what was at issue was to see how far people could be pressed to continue to harm others. And the first study showed that 65% of participants were willing to keep delivering shocks to the point of unconsciousness, what they believed to be unconsciousness. And that is the data we talk about a lot. We sort of just say, oh, well, Stanley Milgram showed that 65% of people are willing to kill someone if they're told to. We are just a bunch of sheep. Too bad. Time to go to work. Evil is prevalent. Whatever. But the experiments were actually more complex than that. So here's the thing. The baseline study was only one of dozens. Stanley Milgram kept doing the experiment and changing the variables each time. And with each change, he found fewer and fewer people willing to harm others. If the person wasn't in a different room with a window, if the person was in the same room, the numbers dropped. If the scientist wasn't dressed in scientist gear and presented as a fancy Yale scientist, the number dropped. And also, interestingly, they looked at how people responded from 4 different prompts, verbal prompts given by the scientist. And they had to develop this and study it because people were resisting. People were rebelling against doing this. They were arguing. They were trying to figure out ways out of it. So they had to develop this set of standard prompts. And you can listen to this happen. So there were 4 standards. On the first objection, the first response was to say, please go on. If the resistance continued, the second would be, the experiment requires that you continue. If the person still objected, the scientist would say, prompt 3, it's absolutely essential that you continue. And if that didn't work, the fourth prompt was, you have no other choice, teacher. But here's the interesting thing. Once they got to the fourth prompt, that's when people would outright start to disobey and leave. They would say vehemently, I do have a choice. I do have a choice. And they would rebel. So here's the interesting thing, is that we say these experiments show that people follow orders, but what they actually show is that as soon as you tell people it's an order, they won't do it. It's the opposite of what we say about these. People will not. So where does this land us with Pilate making this decision to end Jesus' life? Here's another thing we learned. When people participated in this study, when they chose to hurt others, when they did so willingly and admitted as much, they were doing so according to their own written responses afterward because they were contributing to a higher good. And they would write this, even if it meant hurting someone temporarily. They felt that it was important to engage in this high-stakes, prestigious scientific experiment to help the cause, to further knowledge and understanding. It was not blind obedience. They were engaged in the task and thinking through it. They were trying to be good participants in the task. They were not doing it because they had to. They did it. They hurt other people because they thought they ought to. Those experiments didn't show that people follow orders without thinking. Something worse, I think. The experiment showed that people chose to hurt each other because they thought they were doing the right thing. There is a speech that Himmler gave to a group of SS leaders before they were going to go commit a mass atrocity, a mass killing. And what he said to them was, of course you don't want to do this. Of course, no one wants to be killing other people. We realize this is hard work, but it is for the ultimate good of Germany. It is necessary to advance our noble cause. I don't know about you, but I find this much more frightening than an assessment of humanity that assumes blind obedience. And there is a reason that Mother Church over the years has learned to refer to the devil as the great deceiver. Last week during spring break, a group of students from our campus ministry and Elizabeth, my co-pastor, and I went to the U.S.-Mexico border to El Paso and Juarez. And one of the things we did on that trip was talk with Border Patrol agents about their experience of their work. And one morning we drove to Las Cruces in New Mexico and spent 5 hours in court watching people who had crossed the border be processed for misdemeanors and felonies. And we were able to talk with the judge for about 20 minutes afterward and ask him some questions. And one of the most consistent things we heard about people whose livelihood depends on enforcing laws that rip birthing mothers from their children, dying fathers from their sons, that have caused over 10,000 deaths in the desert, is that they said that someone needs to do it. It's just their job. Their job's a good one. It's done for a good cause, making a living for their families, protecting our country, out of a desire for violent criminals to not be present in a community where their kids live. So think for a minute about Pontius Pilate. We know from other accounts that he was dismal at his job in Palestine. He got yanked back home after only 18 months. Even his bosses were like, dude, you have no idea what you're doing. This has blown up. So that night, in all of this Passover noise and threats of insurrection under his terrible leadership, and not being sure about what he's supposed to do with this random guy who doesn't seem that bad, and the bandit, but there's rules about releasing someone that he doesn't really get, he's tired of this job. He just wants to go home to his wife and have a nice glass of wine. We think he's thinking deeply about this question, about what to do with the Son of God, but he's not. Most of us aren't. He's just trying to get through the day and do his job. He might even be trying to fail badly enough that he does get back sent to a real city and being stuck instead of being stuck in that horrible desert outpost where nothing happens. Pilate thought he was doing the right thing. So did Annas and Caiaphas. Every person in this story of the murder of God believes they're doing the right thing. Honestly, I can't think of anything bleaker. We all think we're doing the right thing, mostly. And yet the world is full of children's bodies full of bullets, sometimes from those who are sworn to protect all of us. Full of priests who abuse those we're supposed to bless. Full of people who break vows to their families. Full of war, full of mediocrity, full of $18 billion federal apparatuses designed to punish people who want to work to feed their babies. It's endless. We all think we're doing the right thing, and the world is a horror movie. And today, the day that God bleeds from a branch in the sky and then coughs out his last breath, we have to sit with it. With the reality of our justifications and our self-indulgence, our desire to protect our own instead of our desire to protect God's own. Our addiction to propriety over a sick and dying homeless prophet. Today we have to sit with it. Instead of explaining it, instead of patching theology all over it, instead of pretending that we're exempt. Instead of pretending that we let all this happen because it's for some noble cause. Today we sit with that reality of our nature and realize that it can kill God. Today we just sit with it, and we do not move.